Hi guys, so we're going to go ahead and just do this entire next problem together. So if you look at this graph basically shows what time the sun rises on certain months. So it has like January and then shows you what time it rises, February shows you what time it rises, all that. Before we start, let's go ahead and put number values underneath the January, February, March, April. So that way we can know like what this x-axis represents. So I'm going to go ahead and put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so we can keep it as numbers. We know that these represent the months 11 and 12. And then our origin is here at 0. I'm going to go ahead and just draw my y-axis just so it's clear. So my y-axis represents the sunrise time, whereas this x-axis represents the number, like the month. Okay, so the first question is going to ask you to find the domain of the graph. So what the domain is, it's the range of your x values, range of x values. It's basically the smallest x value you have, smallest x value, all the way over to the largest x value. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to find what's the smallest x value of our graph and the largest x value of our graph, and that's going to be our domain. So looking at my graph and only my x-axis, so I'm only going to look at my x-axis, I'm basically looking like, okay, what are the x values of my graph at this point? So I'm going to go up to my graph. This point here is over 12 up 10, basically. So over 12 up 10. And then this beginning point is over 0 up 10. So looking at only the x values of the start of my graph and the end of my graph starts at 0 and it ends at 12. So I could say the domain is from 0 to 12. And there's a couple ways you can write domain. You can do it with those arrows there, or you can do it with brackets and then 0, 12. But the reason we use brackets instead of parentheses is we don't want people to think that this is a point. This is the domain. So that's why this domain makes sense, because it ends at 12 because there are only 12 months. I know the 0 seems weird because you're like, wait, there's not 0 months, there's 1 month, right? Think of this graph as like, this is the end of January, whereas this is the beginning of January. So that's why that domain makes sense in terms of the context of the problem. So x value represents the months, so there can't be negative months. There can't be negative months, which is why we don't go any smaller than 0. And there's no more than 12, because then it just starts cycling back. So on your response, you can have some variation of this. Go ahead and make sure you for sure have the domain somehow written, and then just give me a little explanation on why it makes sense with your problem. And there's only 12 months. Okay, and then again throughout all of this or any of this, if you need a break or if it's going too fast or whatever it may be, go ahead and just press pause in the video and then press play whenever you're ready. Okay, so the second question, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of this. So if you're not ready for it to leave, please pause the video because I'm getting rid of it. The second question asks you for your range, and it's basically the same exact thing as your domain, but with the y values. So it's the range of y values. And you're going to find what's the smallest possible y value, smallest y value of your graph, to the largest y value. So go ahead and take a look at that graph and see if you have any ideas. I'm looking only at my y-axis now. So just at my y-axis. What's the lowest your graph goes here? Does it go all the way down to 1? Does it go all the way? Where's the lowest and the highest? So the lowest point of your graph, or the smallest y value, is going to be 3 here. Because see, the lowest, it's 3. So this actual point is over 6 up 3, or 3 a.m. And the largest your y value goes are these maximums right here. So what's nice about a range is this range is our max and our min, basically. And these are at 10. So this is like over 0 up 10, over 12 up 10. Oops. Okay, so just looking at our y values, it's the smallest y value or the lowest y value, to the highest y value. So our range is going to be from the smallest y value, which was 3, to the highest y value, which was 10. Or you could do 3 to 10, like that. And how it makes sense in the context of the problem is you want to think, okay, what does y represent? Y represented the sunset time. Was it sunset or sunrise? I think it's sunset. Oh no, it's sunrise. So y represented the sunrise time. So we can say y represents sunrise. So sunrise, the sun will rise, the sun will rise between 3 and 10 a.m. And this is throughout the year. So what's nice about this range is it lets us know, like, okay, the weather or whatever in Alaska, the sunrise in Alaska is a little funky, but we know that no matter what time of year it is, it's going to rise between 3 and 10 a.m. The final portion of this video is going to be going over how to write a cosine and a sine function. Sorry this video is so long, so again, if you need a break, please pause it, but we're going to go ahead and keep pushing. So if you recall, cosine functions, they follow this format: y equals a cosine of, and then it just goes in alphabetical order, bx plus c, close parentheses, plus d. It's okay if you didn't memorize this. This is fine. I only memorize it because I taught it a cajillion times. This is our standard cosine function here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to replace A, B, C, and D here. So A, if you recall, stands for your amplitude. And you find the amplitude of a sine graph or any curve by doing the max minus the min and then dividing it by 2. So go ahead and take a minute and look at your graph. Where are your maximums of the curve? And where is the minimum of your curve? So the max is going to be that highest point. So the max of this graph is 10, right? 10 here, 10 there. And the min is the lowest point, which is 3. This whole point is over 6 sub 3. So we're going to go ahead and do the max, which was 10, minus the min 3, and then divide it by 2. So 10 minus 3 is 7. 7 divided by 2 is 3.5 or 3.5. So then I'm going to have that the amplitude equals 3.5. And I'm going to highlight this because we're just going to plug it into our formula at the end. All right, next one is to find our b. So what b is, it's 2 pi divided by the period. And we've gone over the period before, I think in like unit 8. The period, oops, spelled that wrong. Oof. The period is either from min to min or max to max. Max to max or min to min horizontally. So if I'm looking at this graph, I'm going to get rid of these points real quick. I only have one minimum here, so I want to do max to max. So my 2 maximum points are right up here. These points are over 0 up 10 and over 12 up 10, right? Because December represented 12. So how I can find my period, the period is basically just this horizontal distance. So how far do you have to go from 0 to get to 10? And it's 10. So the period for this graph is equal to 10. Oh, not 10, sorry, it's 12. My bad. 12. Okay, fix that. So the period is basically the horizontal distance that it takes to get from like your max to max. So how far over do you have to go to get from this max to this max? And you have to go over 12. So my period equals 12. That's not my final answer though. To get b, you have to do b equals 2 pi over the period. So it's going to be 2 pi over 12. And then this can be reduced by dividing the numerator and the denominator by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is just 1. So it would be 1 pi. But remember, if there's a 1 there, we can just write pi. And then 12 divided by 2 is 6. So B, let me move this, B equals pi over 6. Same thing, I'm going to highlight this because we're going to come back to it later. Okay, next is to find C, and C, if you recall, is your starting point. And it's the x value of your starting point. Remember, you can start either at a max or a min, or at an intersection with the midline, but we will get to that later because we haven't even found the midline yet. So starting at a max or a min will make the graph a cosine graph, which is what we wanted. If you recall from earlier in the semester, depending on where we started, our starting point, it decided whether the graph was cosine or sine. Max or min automatically means your graph is a cosine. So that's what we're going to have here. So going back up to my graph, I want to start at a max. I'm going to go ahead and pick this max here, 0, 10. So my C is the x value of my starting point. So if my starting point is here, that means my C is the x value, which is 0. So I'm going to come down here and say start at 0, 10, which means that C is equal to 0. Okay, same thing, highlighting this, coming back for it later. And finally, we're going to find D. D is the midline. The midline is basically splitting your graph in half. So if you were to look at this graph and literally draw a line down the middle, where would that be? We can kind of estimate it here and be like, okay, I think it would be like right here maybe-ish. Like that looks like half. But we can find out exactly how much by doing the max, and instead of minus, we're going to add them. Max plus the min, divide it by 2. This is essentially taking the average of your max and your min and cutting it in half. So my max was 10, my min is 3. So my midline is going to be 10 plus 3 divided by 2. 10 plus 3 is 13. 13 divided by 2 is 6.5 or 6.5. So then I'm going to come here and say D equals 6.5. Okay, so now I have everything to fill in. Y equals A cosine of B, bx plus C plus D. And I'm going to start plugging these in. So I'm going to just start scrolling back up and saying, okay, what was A? A is 3.5. B is pi over 6. So I'm going to go here. Y equals, and instead of A, I'm going to go ahead and put 3.5 cosine. And then bx, B was pi over 6. So I'm going to put pi over 6x. Plus my C value. My C value was 0. So it's going to be plus 0, close parentheses, plus my D value, which was 6.5. Oh, sorry, and I didn't go back up and draw my D value on the graph, just so you can see that 6.5 perfectly splits this graph in half. So if I go to 6.5, that's right about here, and that's where it's going to split the graph. Sorry, that was a side note. This is your equation of this graph, essentially. So I can type this onto Desmos, and it would make that graph. It would make the curve. The amplitude is here, 3.5. This is my B term, which we got using the period. This is C, and then this is D here. This can actually be simplified a step further by getting rid of this 0 here. So since it's plus 0, we can essentially just get rid of it. And our final answer would be Y equals 3.5 cosine of pi over 6x. And then we can just close the parentheses plus 6.5. This is your final answer for number 3. On the Google Doc, go ahead and just type, you could like type COS for cosine. And then to get the pi symbol, you can insert pi using like the insert symbol key. But if you can't enter that, just go ahead and write pi, or you could do like pi and then the slash key 6x. It's fine. Like I'll be able to figure it out as long as you have, unless you like try to make it clear. Okay, finally, let's go ahead and wrap this up with number 4. So 4 wants you to make a sine graph. So what the sine graph does is we can basically use A, B, and D not C. So I'm going to take that same A, B, and D that we just found. So A, which was the amplitude, was 3.5. B was pi over 6. And C, or not C, can't use C. D was 6.5. We're going to use these same values to plug in for y equals a sine of b times x plus c plus d. So notice it's the same formula, except we just switched the sine in with the cosine. The only other difference that also occurs is when you have a sine graph, you can't start at a max or min. You have to start at the midline. So that's why I wanted to draw that in on the graph. Oops. So for sine graphs. So going back up to my graph, I have that lovely midline there. I have to start on a point on that midline. Right away, my eye kind of goes here, and I'm like, oh, that point looked like it was pretty on the midline. Let's go with that one. This would be over 9 up 6.5, 6.5. So this is going to be my new starting point for my sine graph because it's an intersection, I don't know. It touches this midline here. And that's the requirement when you write a sine function. It has to intercept the midline. So my starting point is 9, 6.5. I'm going to write that down here. So we're going to say start at 9, 6.5, which means my C is going to be the x value, which is 9 here. So now I'm going to rewrite this sine equation, plug in A, B, C, and D. Y equals, instead of A, 3.5, sine of B is pi over 6, x plus D, C is now 9, so this is going to be the 9, plus D, which was 6.5. One thing I forgot to mention is the positive or negative. So if this, my starting point, let's see where it's at. So this is a positive starting point because if you look at where your point is, it like the next points are going up. If I would have picked a starting point, let's say over here, that would cause my graph to be negative or my sine function to be negative because it's going down. Okay, but since the point we picked is going up, we can go ahead and leave this sine function as a positive sine function. So this is the answer to number 4. Thank you for staying with me. Great job.